We're now doing Commonwealth Corps. You're doing first.
Okay. And he needs the drink.
Yeah, okay.
Good afternoon. Let's get started. Our speaker next week will be the Nuclear Regulatory Commission Commissioner, William C. Ostendorf. He will talk to us about the status report of the U.S. nuclear energy program. It's a great pleasure to introduce to you our speaker today, Russell Gould. Russell is a senior member of the Wall Street Journal's Global Energy team. He has been reporting and writing on global energy issues for over a decade now. And his writings has really have had a tremendous impact, especially focusing on the U.S. energy boom and the use of hydraulic fracturing. To just give you a sense of it, his coverage of the Deepwater Horizon incident was honored with the Gerald Loeb Award, and it was also a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize. So you can get a sense of really the impact his writing has had. His first book is about to come out. I checked this morning, and in Amazon it says April 8th.
Hopefully.
So I really look forward to it. The title is The Boom, How Fracking Ignited the American Energy Revolution and Changed the World. He has held previous positions at the San Antonio Express News and the Philadelphia Inquirer, and he holds a degree from the Columbia University in history. Please join me in welcoming Russell.
Thank you, Griffin. Yeah, I think, am I on? Yeah. So thank you for mentioning that I've got a history degree from Columbia, because that really undermines my credibility here. So speaking of credibility, I actually wanted to, I'm here with engineers and people who are dealing with policy, and I really, that's not my specialty. I report and cover what's going on out in the world. But I did want to establish that I do have some credibility here. I visited my first frac pad in the Barnett Shale in 2003. It was the summer of 2003. So this is back, people didn't even call it fracking yet. No one knew what to call it. Unconventional gas was sort of the main name. It was not on anyone's radar screen. And my tour guide that day was a Devon engineer. I think he used to work for Mitchell. I think he's still with Devon, named J. Ewing. So anyone want to take a guess what his middle initial was? J.R. Ewing. That's right. All right, let's see if we can get this going here. Hold on. There we go. All right. So this is my credibility. Anyone? Is this working for anyone, or is the audience here too young? Too young. Well, there are a couple of references for the older folks. Anyway, so J.R. Ewing was my tour guide that day. I actually went back with him about a year or two ago. He's still working there, and he's been very involved in the development of the Barnett, as active as it is, which really, frankly, it's not very active these days because, as most of you know, natural gas prices, well, up until the last couple of weeks, were pretty low. So I had a good tour guide. I was trying to think, I think I've visited 12 to 18 different frac sites. I've been to Pennsylvania, Marcellus, Texas, multiple places in Texas. I was out in North Dakota one day when there were 60-mile-per-hour winds sweeping across the prairie, and it was cold. It was October, but it was very cold. We're here in Austin, as I like to say. We're south of the Barnett, north of the Eagle Ford, west of the Haynesville, and east of the Permian. So we're right in the middle of all the action. All right, so this is sort of my guidepost to the talk today. Otto von Bismarck, great quote. He's actually a great quote meister. He's the one who came up with the quote that laws are like sausages. It's better not to see how they're made. He's very good at quotes. God has a special providence for fools, drunks, and the United States of America. And this, I think, actually has a lot of relevance for what's going on with fracking right now. So let me explain. So here's the United States of America, or Frackistan, as I called it for a little while, just because it was it was actually originally going to be my title of my book, but then we changed it. Well, the sense was that people would look at it and think it was about Afghanistan or Pakistan, so it's a whole marketing thing that went into it. It was new to me. So just before we get going on the United States and why God has a special providence for the United States. This energy boom we're going through is a very big deal. And whether you like it or dislike it, there's no question that it is changing the United States. We talk about fracking. Fracking is a little bit of a shorthand. I think most of you know what we're really talking about. This combination of hydraulic fracturing, which I assume a lot of people here know what it is. It's basically pumping water down into a well and using the pressure, the force of the water to create new fractures. It also usually involves horizontal drilling, although people don't talk about it because it's not as catchy as fracking is. But make no mistake, what is going on here, from the infrastructure to which parts of the country are doing well economically, to the midstream, to how we're processing the hydrocarbons, to foreign policy, foreign relations, that is all being impacted right now by what's going on. It's so big that the Rolling Stones have written a song about it, as has Yoko Ono. And if you guys do not pay attention, I will play you Yoko's song, because it is really horrible. Look it up on YouTube if you don't believe me. So let's take this in reverse order. The United States. This is what the United States looks like right now. This is what it looked like, I think, about 60 million years ago. Big C, a C right down the middle of the country. Of course, the country didn't quite look like this because there was a lot of movement. And this is why a couple years ago the fossil of a large predatory shark was found in Kansas. Sort of helps explain it. But this is actually really important because most continents have mountain chains down the middle and then coastal plains. The United States has two big mountain chains. You've got the Rockies on one end and Appalachian chain on the other. Everything else in the middle was this giant seaway. And over many years, you had these, the zooplankton and all these, as you can tell, this is where my lack of scientific knowledge really comes in, these small microscopic organisms that were living, they were eating all this great nutrient-rich or nutrients in the sea, and the sun was coming down, and they would eat and have a party, and then they would die, and they'd go down to the bottom, and eventually you created this large sediment down at the bottom. It gets covered over by rock, pressure, temperature, a few millennia, and you have shale. And it really was this, there are other countries, shales exist all over the world and are currently starting to be exploited in China, in South Africa, Poland, Russia is starting to look at its shales. But the United States has a lot of big contiguous shales because it had this big seaway right in the middle, sort of trapped between the two mountain chains. And that's really important because if you sort of think about where most of the big shale plays are, they're right in the middle. North Dakota, Texas, the Haynesville and the Fayetteville right there in Louisiana and Arkansas. The Marcellus, this isn't a good map. I've seen other maps where the inland sea sort of stretches right up into Pennsylvania, or the way everything moved around. But basically, this is why the U.S., let me just posit, the U.S. got really lucky. It, by a dint of its geology, had a lot of shales. And shales are sort of important because they are the source rock. I mean, pretty much anywhere you go in the world, when you've got a big collection of oil and gas, ultimately it has come from a source rock. It's migrated up, it's been trapped, and that's what the industry originally went for, these big reservoirs. Well, now they're going for the source rock. And there's a lot of source rock in the United States. So the U.S. got lucky and was endowed with a lot of these frackable shales. So let's go now to the drunks. We've done the United States. Here are the drunks. This is actually where it gets interesting. Two guys in the story, Colonel Drake and Colonel Roberts. Most people who are familiar with the history, 19th century history in the United States, or the history of the oil industry, or have read The Prize, know about Colonel Drake. He's the guy, first of all, he's not really a colonel, which is why I have it in quotes. Some of his backers thought that would be impressive, so they sent a letter ahead to Titusville, Pennsylvania, addressed to Colonel Drake, so that the, quote, backwoodsman would be impressed. And it worked. So he goes to Titusville, he drills the first well, goes down, I think it's 69 feet, hits oil, and that's great. So on the other side is Colonel Roberts. Now, he's actually more important to this story, and I think he's kind of a more interesting guy. He was an inventor, lived in New York City. One of his first patents was for a device that helped dentists mold Indian rubber for dentures. So he was involved in the denture trade, and apparently made a lot of money off that. The Civil War breaks out. He signs up on the Union side, recruits a whole bunch of troops, and is appointed lieutenant colonel. I guess that's sort of how it works. If you can bring troops in, you get to be you get a position. So he actually is a colonel. And so he's stationed outside Washington, D.C. He's doing training and drilling, and I guess maybe he gets bored, or maybe he's scared stiff, or maybe both, but he shows up drunk for a dress parade one day. Now, I'm not pointing fingers here, because if I was about to get sent into the Civil War, given the state of medicine and everything else that's going on, I probably would have been drinking a lot too. But he's brought up for court-martial, which I always thought was kind of interesting, right in the middle of the war to court-martial someone for being drunk. But I actually got his court-martial papers. It's true. He's waiting for the tribunal's decision, and they send him off to the Battle of Fredericksburg. So, for those of you who didn't study 19th century American history like myself, quick reminder. Actually, I didn't know this either. That's not what I studied. But the Battle of Fredericksburg, you had, up here in the red, Confederate troops on a high position, the Union troops coming across the Rappahannock River and trying to scale those heights, which was not a good idea. And this is an old photo painting I found of the artillery that was up on the hill. And they were basically just bombarding the Union. It was a slaughter for the Union. 8,000 dead. And so Colonel Roberts is somewhere around here and is being hemmed in by our artillery, and allegedly has this breakthrough, because he notices that when the artillery comes down, if it lands on the ground, the explosion goes in all directions. But if it lands in this canal and goes underwater, the weight of the water tamps down the explosion, and the explosion goes out. This is what he would say later in patent litigation. And so he thinks to himself, oh, that's sort of interesting, because if I can control the direction of the explosion, maybe I can use that in some of those new oil wells that they have out in Titusville. So after he's court-martialed for being drunk, he heads out to Pennsylvania. And, so by this time, Colonel Drake, this guy, has discovered oil. Everyone's excited. They're drilling derricks everywhere. He goes out there, and he's got this little device called the Edwards torpedo. It's basically on a little line. You put it down the well. You cover it with water. It's got a little kind of fishing line. You drop a weight down. It explodes the torpedo. And because it's underwater, the force goes outward into the rock. So, I'm researching this, and I'm thinking, okay, this is sort of interesting, but was this really fracking like we know it? It's certainly not hydraulic fracking, but was it fracking? So here is the original patent issued to the Roberts Petroleum Torpedo. This is sort of the scheme that the way it issued, 1866. So here's, this is the torpedo goes down, the fracture, and here's what it says. This is what I found so interesting. In my improvement method of increasing the capacity of wells, I fracture the rock containing the oil to some distance around the wells, thus creating artificial seams and enabling me to connect the well thereby with seams containing the oil that would not have been otherwise reached by the well. If that's not fracking, I don't know what it is. I mean, basically, he's taking this idea, you're going to drill a well, maybe you hit the oil seam, maybe you don't, but if I can create this explosion and create artificial fractures, I'd connect up with the oil seam, and my wells would be more successful. So, long story short, he starts charging a lot of money for this invention. He has it patented. People try to make their own torpedoes. Roberts sues everyone. He has the most lawsuits in the late 19th century. Or I found he's alleged to have the most lawsuits. He had a lot of lawsuits. He hires the Pinkerton detectives. The torpedo war breaks out, where the Pinkerton detectives are running all over western Pennsylvania trying to arrest people for making their own torpedoes. So there are a bunch of people who are trying to avoid the Pinkertons. They've got to do it at night to try to be stealthy, and they light off these unsanctioned torpedoes at night under the moon, and that's where we get the word moonlighting, which is also the name, once again, it's going to go over most of your heads, of a 1980s television show which launched the career of a very young actor who was later known for blowing things up in his movies. So there you go. So anyway, so that's the story of the drunk. That's how the drunk comes into it. We've got Colonel Roberts. And this is sort of what's fascinating. A couple things. Colonel Drake dies penniless. He's literally found wandering the streets of New York by an old associate, convinces the state of Pennsylvania to give him sort of a sinecure or something like that, a few $100s a month. I forget exactly what, but he's basically destitute. Colonel Roberts dies one of the richest people in the United States because of his invention. And that's sort of, we kind of have a little bit of the history of the oil field here. 100 years ago, you have this wildcatter, lots of hopes and aspirations. Maybe you're going to hit oil, maybe you're not. You use superstition. Back then they used to drill, they use dowsing rods, and they would drill on graveyards. That was sort of one of the superstitions, because they thought if you drilled in graveyards, you would hit oil, which actually, as it turns out, may actually have some truth to it, because graveyards are usually on hills, which might indicate there's an anticline underneath. But then, most wildcatters would die penniless. You would just keep drilling, and maybe you get lucky, maybe you wouldn't. But this other guy comes along and says, I can help you improve the odds of finding oil. And I'm going to charge you a little more. The wells are going to get more expensive, but your odds of finding oil would be improved, and you're going to get more. Spend more money to get more oil. That's what's been happening in the oil field for the 100 years. I mean, that sort of sets out what's to come. Okay, so, brief history. So I'm going to sort of speed through, since there are no drunks as far as I know in this. 1947, Stanley, one of the old Standard Oil companies, researchers in Tulsa for Stanley come up with the idea to hydraulically fracture the rock. They use napalm as one of their first liquids, because it was right after World War II, and there's a lot of napalm left over. Apparently we use napalm in the Pacific Theater. I didn't know that. And so this is just real quickly. So why do we jump from the 1860s to 1947? Because back in the turn of the century, you'd hit gushers. You didn't need to frack anything. Think about Spindletop. Big oil coming out everywhere. Your problem was to stop it. Your problem was you were driving down the prices because you had too much of it. So it wasn't until the 1940s when all of a sudden, we kind of begun to hunt the elephants. There were still some, but you have to start coming up with ways to make better wells. So this is what they're doing. They're working on it. They come up, they patent the idea of hydraulically fracturing the rock. So with always this discussion, how fracking is a new technology, it's an old technology. Well, you can really see it both ways. 1967, United States government actually uses a nuclear bomb to try to frack a well outside of Farmington, New Mexico. We actually do this several times. 69, we use a bigger bomb. 2 years later, Nixon talks about using nuclear stimulation experiments to get more gas. He was behind it. They're kind of interesting. That whole nuclear thing ends because they were going to do even bigger. They kept getting bigger and bigger. The problem was they could frack the rock, they fracture the rock, but it usually closed up. And even when it didn't close up, the gas was radioactive, so there's all sorts of problems with that. But they kept trying to do it, and they were going to do it in Wyoming, much bigger, multiple explosions. But the congressman, Tino Roncalio, put his foot down and said no, and it was kind of controversial, and he got tired. He retires, opening up a congressional seat that Dick Cheney nabbed, starting his political career. All right, so 1980s, fracking is in wide use, mostly in more porous sandstones. Or more porous formations, East Texas, Austin Chalk, etc. You use gels. June 11th, 1998, young completion engineer, still very active, working for Mitchell Energy, has this new idea. Says, you know what, the oilfield service companies are charging us for the gel. That's how they wouldn't charge you for horsepower; they'd charge you for gel. And so he said, well, maybe we could try to do away with the gel and just do a cheaper frack. With water. And so he goes and gets permission to do 3 wells. He sands all of them over, screens them over with sand. They're unsuccessful. The fourth well, the fourth one wasn't good. This is his 5th well, the S.H. Griffin number 4. He successfully fractures it. It is the best. Mitchell Energy has been trying to frack the Barnett Shale since '82. 16 years later, this well is so much better than anything they've ever had. It's really the first successfully hydraulically fractured well with water, slick water. There it is. It's up near Ponder, Texas. I visited it with the completion engineer. His name is Nick Steinsberger. It was kind of fun. We were driving around, and he said that the wells were kind of like his babies. He knew some of them better than his own children. So that's dedication. So back in 1998, the idea was you could not frack shale. It was just too dense. Couldn't do it. literally, I've gone back and looked at the petroleum engineering books, and they would just skip over it. And when they didn't skip over it, they would just not pay much attention to it. It just wasn't done. Steinsberger thought you could do it, and Mitchell backed him, and lo and behold. So at this point, I mean, everyone sort of knows George Mitchell. It's, he died last year. He was, his wife had just been diagnosed with a terminal illness, and he wasn't doing well. He wanted to get out. He wanted to sell his company and get out. He could not convince anyone to buy Mitchell Energy. He had come up with this new way to frack wells. I mean, he had the whole thing worked out. No one would buy it. Tries to sell it once, doesn't. Finally sells it to Devon, which adds horizontal wells. Mitchell really they tried a couple horizontal wells, but not. All right, let me see if I can get this going. This is kind of neat. So this is, hold on. This is 1997 Barnett Shale wells. So this is mostly all of the wells that since 82 to 97 Mitchell had drilled, and look what happens. The red dots are vertical. The black dots are, black dots are vertical. Red dots are the new horizontal wells. 2001, and then it just explodes once Devon gets involved and you start bringing in the horizontal wells. I think this only goes up to 2010, but you can sort of see just how big, and each one of these is a well. I think there's right? I mean, so just think about that. 13 years earlier, there was just a little bit, Wise County, and now it's spread. Johnson County went from having like 10 wells to 2,000. It was just phenomenal. It's just, the amount of growth is amazing. And it's probably even a little bit more since then, come to think of it. Anyway, so what can we learn from this? Fracking works. The technology works. It's real. Because there's such a small drainage area, you need to drill a lot of wells, a lot of pads, a lot of wells. And because they deplete so quickly, you need to drill a lot of wells. And that actually has more to do with Wall Street. Wall Street likes to see growth. They don't want you just, they want to see growth of revenue. They want to see growth of volume. And so if you're drilling and fracking a well and it's depleting within a year or two, not fully depleted, but very, it's dropping from a very high production to very low production, you need to keep drilling and drilling and drilling and drilling. And that's really kind of what that shows you. So all right, we kind of covered this. So you guys know this better than I do. Low permeability, etc. So fools, our third one. We've got the United States, we've had drunks, now we're getting to fools. So this gets a little more complicated, but I think I'm going to try to bring it around. All right, energy revolution. No question. But so what do I mean by revolution? King coal's reign as sort of this dominant fuel used for power generation is ending. Petroleum's stranglehold on transportation fuels is starting to ease slightly. Trucks, trains are starting to switch over to natural gas because it's cheaper. We used to be importing tons of oil. We're importing a lot less now. We're no longer on Hubbard's Peak. I mean, if you remember Hubbard's Peak, which basically says that it's sort of this intellectual grounding for peak oil, that in any geographic area, the rate of oil production will follow a bell curve. And we were following a bell curve. And right about here, all of a sudden, we start going back up again. So Hubbard's Peak seems to be over, and now something different is going on. But energy revolutions, much like political revolutions, can get kind of messy and chaotic. And once you set that change in motion, it's hard to figure out where it ends. And I think that's sort of where we are right now. So, for example, this whole thing starts as a gas, going after natural gas. January 2005, I just set U.S. oil and gas production at 1, and look what happens. Gas is starting to go up, oil's sort of trending. I think this was the hurricanes. And all of a sudden, in the last couple of years, we're getting a lot more oil now. The fracking revolution's really become an oil revolution. It muddies the story, it makes it a more interesting story. So natural gas has brought undeniable benefits. We're using a lot less coal, fewer greenhouse gas emissions per unit of electricity generated, less expensive power. U.S. manufacturing is becoming a lot more globally competitive. But now, that you start talking about lower greenhouse gas emissions, and then you've got to deal with the fact that the same technology which brought us that is now bringing us a lot more oil production. So just going to kind of go through just sort of what's changed. I find this to be fascinating. This is a change in oil production. So overall oil production all over the world. Saudi Arabia producing nearly 1 million barrels. This is in barrels per day. Oh yeah, 1,000 barrels per day. Saudi Arabia is producing almost 1 million barrels a day more. The United States is 2 million barrels a day up from where it was in 2008. And it's actually probably higher. It's closer to 3 million now. The Bakken, which was almost non-existent in 2008, just hit 1 million barrels a day. Enormous wells. Excuse me, enormous oil fields. More than half of global oil growth of the last few years has come in the United States. So it's hard to say what this would have been like if that hadn't happened, if fracking hadn't brought so much growth to the United States. But I think we can make some broad observations. Saudi Arabia has a lot of spare capacity, but during that period, its spare capacity was a little on the low side. It was trying to make up for lost Iranian production. And it's not inconceivable that without this added 2 million barrels a day, that the market really, really would have tightened considerably. And the only way in an oil market, we saw this in 2008, when you need to kill off some demand, you do it through price spikes. So Trevor Hauser just came out with a new book, which is fascinating and worth reading. He's an economist at the Peterson Institute, and he argued that without that 2 million barrels a day, that could well have been too much, or a price spike, an oil price spike, could well have been too much for the fragile U.S. economic recovery to handle. I think he's probably pretty right about that. So the oil boom and the natural gas boom, it lowered volatility, it cut energy bills, and was an effective stimulus. But this won't last. We're in a new equilibrium right now where we have an abundance of natural gas in the United States. We've got a lot of oil, a lot of changes going on. But just sort of keep this in mind, and we'll come back to it. This is not a permanent solution. It's given the United States some breathing space, but 5 years, 10 years, we're going to be in a very different scenario. If I've learned anything from being an energy reporter over the last 10 years is that nothing really stays. There's no real static in the energy industry. You're at a nice point, you think you've got it figured out, and then it all changes. Want a couple more graphs. This is just fascinating. I find it fascinating. U.S. production and consumption, everything in between is net imports. As you can see, from 1980 on, really from 70, if it went back, you start getting more and more imports, and it just shrinks. And it's expected to stay very tight. We're not at energy independence, but we're a lot closer than we used to be. That gap in 2005 peaked at 30%. 30% of the oil was imported. We were down to 14% by 2013. So it even shrunk from right there. So why does this matter? The overwhelming conventional wisdom back a few years ago was that imports were going to continue to grow. We were going to run out of natural gas. We're going to have to start importing that. All that's changed. So we have a surge in energy supply coupled with the economic recession, improved fuel economy on cars, decreased energy intensity of the economy, and we've kept, oil and gas prices are high, but they could have really been a lot higher. The U.S. economy needs its fossil fuels. That's just the way we're set up right now. And so two big economic ideas I want to get at before I move on. First, James Hamilton, the UC San Diego economist, has argued that the 79, 2001, 2008 recessions, high energy prices led to each of those or contributed to each of those. And in fact, in 2008, the high gasoline cost caused a severe costly dislocation of the U.S. auto industry. High energy prices matter for the economy. They can be very destructive and damaging. The second big idea is that we tend to have rapid economic growth when we have a surplus of energy. Industrial Revolution, post-World War II, the energy supply doubled in the quarter century after World War II, and we created the middle class in the United States. So sort of, kind of keeping that all in mind. So you sort of get to 2006, energy imports seem to be growing. There was an inevitability of that. Our economic well-being is sort of tied to how much fossil fuels we have, and the fossil fuels we need, the oil and gas, are increasingly coming from parts of the world that we're not exactly friendly with. So that's the context of this quote from George Bush in 2006. Keeping American competitive requires affordable energy, and we have a serious problem. America is addicted to oil. it's just fascinating that a Texas oil man would go to Washington and talk about addiction to oil. But sort of think about that, and here's the rest of the quote, because it's sort of interesting. The rest of the quote goes on, America is addicted to oil, which is often imported from unstable parts of the world. By applying the talent and technology of America, this country can dramatically improve our environment, move beyond a petroleum-based economy, and make our dependence on Middle Eastern oil a thing of the past. So it's not so much a fear of addiction to oil he's talking about. It's a fear of what that addiction to oil does to our foreign policy, how it entangles us with the Middle East. So, what if we don't have to get rid of that addiction to oil? We just have to get rid of that addiction to foreign oil. Because that's really, I mean, everyone always picks up on this, oh, America's addicted to oil. But it wasn't talking about that. It wasn't sort of a Sierra Club green. He was just talking about we can't go on like this because we're becoming too dependent on foreign oil from places that we don't want to be. So what if we could get our oil but not our overseas oil? Thank you. We did. Problem solved. Bakken, Permian, Eagle Ford, huge amounts of oil are coming. So, kind of the big picture here, Michael Weber and I have talked about this. I'll give him credit for coming up with this. I mean, I think he's absolutely right. You had the long-term alignment of government policy, which encouraged some R&D, set a very specific policy about how you're going to handle water. You had market forces pointing in the direction of this. It all comes together, and we have an enormous energy boom. So it sort of drives home the point that if you have a big intractable problem, this is a lesson here. If you align government policy and the market, big things can happen, and clearly they have in the United States. But something else happened. The dial got turned up to 11. Like they talked about in Spinal Tap, it wasn't just a 10, goes all the way up to 11. Wall Street fell in love with the story, starts just throwing money at this, and the growth story. All right, so this came much faster than anticipated. Neither the regulator, the legislature, nor the energy industry was actually prepared to deal with the issues that fracking brought about. What rabble-rouser said this? It was the CEO of Royal Dutch Shell, Peter Voser. He told me that in an interview in 2012. And I think he's right. The industry wasn't ready. It had to lease up acres as quickly as possible and then go drill. Regulators weren't ready for this. Legislators are just now kind of realizing what's going on and what they're supposed to be doing. This is sort of my favorite story. There was an informal survey at a shale gas conference in November 2008. It said, I am confident that I understand reservoir drainage, was one question. So this is reservoir engineers being asked, do they understand reservoir drainage of shale? 4/5 of the engineers responded that they were not confident. So we're several years into the all-out juggernaut of shale drilling, and even the experts themselves didn't quite understand what was going on. This happened very quickly. And so I would argue that there's another defining, in addition to speed, there's another defining feature of the oil boom, and that's that we're producing more energy than ever at our doorstep. So here we have a house. This is right outside of Denver in Berthoud, Colorado, I think it's pronounced. And there you have a drilling rig. Now, for anyone here who is interested or planning to go work for an energy company, there's a lesson in this particular story. This house is owned by Jared Polis, Congressman Jared Polis from Boulder. He's one of the wealthiest people in Congress, which is saying something. That is not his land over there. That is his house. He was not happy. If you're going to drill a well in someone's backyard, be careful if it's a liberal congressman, because he will raise a stink. So that's just a little, tip for people who want to go work for energy companies. But I don't want to make fun of this because it's really important. When I talk to people who live amongst the drilling and the frack fields, hands down, the thing that everyone wants to talk about is traffic, is the smell, is the 24-hour lights while they're being drilled, or the trucks everywhere. Lately, it's been the earthquakes, also triggered, I assume, by injection wells. So this kind of inconvenience, having a drill pad, I think this was like 300 or 400 feet from his house, everything is a lot easier when you get a big bonus payment and you get the royalties. And that's sort of the secret sauce of the U.S. energy boom. Private ownership of mineral rights. People don't talk about it very much, but it's really important. You go outside the United States, and most of the minerals are owned by the state, so it doesn't really work quite as well. So I actually think that the production of energy at our doorstep like this is actually a good thing, and I think it will turn out to be a good thing in the long term, because it forces U.S. energy consumers who use more per capita than anyone else in the world to confront what does it mean to produce the energy that they need. Because what we've been doing for the last several decades has been the exact opposite. We've been importing it, we haven't really thought about where the energy is coming from, and you end up with this. This is the Niger Delta. 8% of the oil imported by the United States from 30 years, 81 to 2011, came from Nigeria. That was down to half. More than $1 trillion worth of oil has been extracted from the region, and Nigeria is not in good shape. A lot of corruption. So when you do it locally, sometimes I sort of think, this is, isn't this kind of what we want, right? I've got this source of energy. It's locally sourced. It's low carbon. I mean, isn't this a good thing? And I actually think, yeah, it really could be. And this is incredibly different than the way it used to be. Remember, think about the big oil booms of the last few decades. You had the Gulf of Mexico. It's happening way out where no one can see. You had Prudhoe Bay happening north of the Arctic Circle. This is happening in people's backyard. There's an intimacy and a proximity going on now that we've never seen before. And so it's become an article of faith, especially among the left, that fracking is bad. It wasn't always this way. We forget this. In 2009, Robert Kennedy, president of the Waterkeeper Alliance, nephew of JFK, hailed the revolution in natural gas production and said that it's made it possible to eliminate most of our dependence on the deadly destructive coal practically overnight. What happened to that? I mean, that's still all true, but that's not what we talk about. So stop and think about fracking. This is a locally sourced fuel, low carbon footprint. It's walloping coal. And it can help create a power distribution system that enables renewables. In fact, I think you could probably argue that the more wind and solar we generate, the more we need natural gas to back it up. And so, all right, so why was there all this resistance to fracking? I think the answer is because the biggest and largest natural gas field that was found was not in Texas. It was in the Northeast. They were not used to it. And that stirred a big backlash. And it was kind of a real culture clash. New York Times article about the actor Mark Ruffalo, who's been really anti-fracking, and kind of captured this split. So Ruffalo lives on a 47-acre ranch in upstate New York, in the southern tier up there. And he wants it to be pristine and quiet. And they interviewed his neighbor, who's a dairy farmer, William Graby. And he said, quote, "We need industry and jobs so we can send our kids to college." And so it really has raised this question, what is land for? Is it for bucolic, quiet, or is it to be worked? Whether it's for a dairy farm or extraction of minerals, and how can you do it? So this is Aubrey McClendon. I'm going to kind of sort of skip. Who is he? Founder, CEO, longtime chairman of Chesapeake Energy. He was insatiable. I think he's the most important person in this whole story. He pushed the pace of fracking very, very quickly. He grabbed as much land as he could. He forced everyone to keep up with him. I've interviewed many CEOs who all said that they just could not keep up with him. He wanted more and more and more. Let me give you an example. By 2008, he owned a stake, in addition to being the CEO of Chesapeake, stake in a television station, owned several restaurants in Oklahoma City, created a tree farm, opened a roadside restaurant on Route 66 with a 66-foot tall soda bottle. His collection of antique boats, he had 18 of them, one worth $1.5 million. He also collected wine bottles. He was considered one of the biggest wine collectors. And he also had this unusual perk. He was allowed to buy a 2.5% stake in every well Chesapeake drilled. That was fine when it started, but by 2008, he personally was producing 147 million cubic feet a day, enough to supply all the residential customers of Connecticut. That ultimately caught up to him, and he had to borrow so much money. It turned out he was borrowing money from companies that Chesapeake was selling to, and he gets booted. But the bottom line is, We went in 10 years from having just fracking the first well in 98. By 2008, U.S. was on its way to becoming the U.S. U.S. was on the way to becoming the world's largest oil and gas producer. We had visions of energy independence. Everything had changed. Think about this. Chevron is 35 years into developing a large offshore gas deposit called Gorgon. They still haven't gotten the first molecule out. They've been working on this for 30 years. In 10 years, everything, the whole world changed. You created enormous oil and gas fields. It's a real challenge for the big oil companies. So Aubrey McClendon didn't, by the way, it's a slightly gratuitous inclusion of a Sports Illustrated cover model, but Kate Upton actually is Aubrey's wife's cousin, I think it is, so he runs in big circles. I'm being a little cheeky here, but these are real quotes. Carl Pope, former head of the Sierra Club, said he thinks Aubrey McClendon will turn out to be one of the major contributors to giving the world a shot at protecting the climate. I mean, it's pretty heady stuff. And the reason is because he found a lot of natural gas. And so this is, I kind of want to get back to the fools real quickly. I know I'm running a little out of time. The Fox-Mulder energy policy, I want to believe, you guys remember the X-Files down in the basement? He had the want to believe. A lot of people, the energy policy in the United States, they want to believe. We want to believe we can run the U.S. economy off wind and solar. I would love that, but I don't think that's realistic. And, and that's what, it's sort of, this is kind of what we have to face right now with fracking and with oil and gas production. There are risks. This is not clean. This is not perfect. There are earthquakes. There is methane leaking out, which can cause climate change that needs to be dealt with. There are volatile organic compounds. There's the potential for water contamination, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But we can potentially manage this if we really focus on it. And that's really kind of the big message I want to get at here. I'm running out of time a little. That we'd be foolish to squander this opportunity. This is an enormous opportunity presented to the United States. An enormous amount of energy, an era of low volatility and relatively low prices. We could just use it all, and in 20, 30 years, we'll be back to where we were before. Or we can use this as an opportunity to migrate over to a different energy landscape. And I think that's what we're doing, but it's sort of one step forward, two steps back. What could go wrong? This is trains, tanker cars outside of Castle, North Dakota. This train crashed in late December, just a couple weeks ago, sending huge, booming clouds of smoke up into the air. Another train crashed in Quebec in the summer and killed 47 people. One of the problems when you create whole new infrastructures, logistics systems, sometimes you don't have a chance to sort of think it through all the way. Oh, this is good, yeah. Even people within the oil and gas industry that I've talked with feel sometimes we're just going too fast and too hard. Robert Harm. So he also calls for moderate. Who is this radical? Yes, chairman of the North Dakota Republican Party. So, there's this sense we need to slow down a little. We've done this breakthrough. We've conquered the technology on the way. We're at a remarkable juncture in energy history. Low fuel prices, volatility. We don't have any economy rattling price jolts, volatility. We'd be fools to squander this opportunity, and that's really what I see from my vantage point. Let's see. Life is good. One day we'll wistfully look back at the 2010s as an idyllic era of low oil and gas prices, volatility, and if we play this right, maybe we won't. Maybe it won't be wistful. All right, buy the book. On sale April 8th, or all these different things. Tweet me, or this or that. All right, thank you very much. Yes, absolutely. Okay. All right, questions, answers. Yeah, go. Yeah. Fine.
Well, I want to believe, I'm conflicted because I own property in the Haynesville, and I was one of the early supporters of fracking because I thought that it would buy us time to cut carbon emissions and move to a more sustainable
Right. Why don't you feel that anymore?
Well, I mean, here we are in 2014, we still don't have a national energy policy. In fact, our legislators are working hard to invent a coherent future strategy for energy.
But we have double-digit growth of renewables.
We do, but, you know, some have estimated that we could withstand 3 times the amount of renewables in our grid that we have now. And yet, you know, people they're overly cautious about, you know, getting out there on the edge of non-baseload power.
Right.
And yet, you know, we rush into fracking like we think we know everything. Well, again, I always wanted to believe that fracking was the key to the future. We can get out of this. Up in a place called Dish, Texas.
Now, Dish Texas had the lawsuit.
Yes.
They had the air emission lawsuit.
And you know, I mean, the Barnett is 10,000 feet deep there. What the data seems to suggest is that, you know, it's not just fugitive methane from the borehole of the well, but that, you know, I mean, for hundreds of yards away from the borehole, methane emissions, apparent fugitive emissions, are up all in the, you know.
I would be much more worried about the emissions from the equipment on the drill pad than I would be from the well. I mean, you've got volatile organic compounds coming out. You can capture this stuff.
Well, you can if it's a point source, but if it's leaking from fractured lithographies within, you know, hundreds of yards from the wellhead, you're not going to capture that.
Yeah, but I haven't seen. I mean, I've seen a lot of peer-reviewed scientific work, and there's been a lot of work coming out over the last couple of years talking about leakage from equipment. I'm more than willing to be corrected. I have not seen that work being done on leakage from.
Well, that's what I mean. No work is being done necessarily on fugitive emissions from a non-point source associated with fracking. I still want to believe, but now I'm suspicious. We need to know because, you know, any potential gains in carbon emissions or, you know, reductions in carbon emissions would be more than offset by.
What's amazed me is like one of the new things that's going on in a lot of these fields is these vapor recovery units, where they're capturing the volatile organic compounds. It's like a rounding error, what it costs to put in a vapor recovery unit. There's a lot of low-hanging fruit, and it should have been done 5 years ago, but there's no reason why it can't be done now. I mean, and so if you're talking about rounding errors to do more water recycling and capturing these VOCs, do it. And the only state I see right now that's really aggressively moving after this is Colorado, and I think it'll be really interesting to see what happens up there.
Russell, great talk. It's a good book. I encourage everyone to buy 4 copies of it. So
Thank you.
Yeah. I want to ask you a question about geopolitics and our inability to predict the future. It seems like as a society, we take the last 3 years and draw a line forward with the trend to say that's the future. And really, it's more like a sine wave or something. We just keep getting it wrong. So a decade ago, Alan Greenspan said we're running out of gas. We all thought we're running out of gas. We built all these import terminals that now sit idle. So now
no, they're not sitting idle. We're now using them to start exporting.
Yes, now we're going to flip them around and make them export.
Right.
And they'll come online right at the same time Mozambique comes online with their gas, and right at the same time Iraqi oil comes on gas. So we'll have our export capabilities online right at the same time geopolitical energy decisions will flood the markets with stuff potentially. Right. So we just set up for our next big bubble bursting, which is like we got 2 to 3 more years and then we're going to crash again, or do you have any view of how this...
Of natural gas?
Yeah, natural gas. I say oil with Iraq and gas with Mozambique.
Yeah, no.
So are we set up for the next, like, oops, blew it again kind of thing?
You know, I think I'm a little cautious using the word bubble because it usually implies speculative investment, and I don't think this is speculative. But this is a commodity, and there's always too much or too little. And I do think we're going to, I would very clearly bet we're looking at oil prices going down, as you say, with Iraq and with too much natural gas out there. I think the big difference is that even though we might go through that period and you'll probably see wells getting choked off, et cetera, some companies running into financial problems, the industry has proved up the existence of this resource. And I think that's the key difference. And it's not as if you don't know. They know this is here. And it's a question of how you exploit it and how you roll it out. And we use the market to do it. You were talking about a national energy policy. We don't have a national energy policy. Our national energy policy is the marketplace. But it's not the worst situation to be in to have too much of something, especially of energy. So, much better that than the alternative. We saw that in 2008. It wasn't pretty.
Good talk, Russell. Also pre-ordered the book, so recommend everybody do it. Kind of on the international front, where do you see China? Are they, how far behind are they? What is
on fracking?
Yeah. On shale
catching up
research,
quickly.
fracking.
From what I understand, there's several major problems in China. One is that the shales are not quite as contiguous. They're more silty and more layered, so you don't have the big chunks of rock to go after. But the bigger problem is water. And in the province where Shell is working, I think it was with CNPC, it's got like the population density of New Jersey. And we really haven't seen, outside of Fort Worth, we really haven't seen that. So I think the big problem is it's really going to be water, and it's going to be dealing with the population. Because once again, it's not a situation like you have in Johnson County, Texas, where people are getting these $500,000 checks to do the drilling. And that's been a real big problem. In fact, you've seen some of my colleagues in China at the Journal reported on this. You've seen blockades where local villagers are upset and they're stopping convoys of trucks going through. So that's a big issue, and I don't know how to resolve that. So I think that will slow things down. I think the United States is going to have the jump on this for 5-10 years. I actually think the next big one to probably come along is the Basenhof in Russia. It's the middle of nowhere. Russia's got all the equipment there. They've got everything. I mean, this is Siberia. This is the Western Siberia. This is the shale that produced the Western Siberian oil fields. So I think once that starts clicking, that will really be really significant and will add to the oversupply of oil along with Iraq.
You mentioned earlier that there were some low-hanging fruit here. What are some other low-hanging fruit that you see?
In terms of making this a better?
Yeah, simpler, greener process.
Well, I think there are a bunch.
Sorry.
No, it's a good question. First of all, I think there needs to be a sense that where you put your injection wells, there needs to be absolutely an investigation of whether you're doing it near any earthquake faults. If you want to stop earthquakes, you stop lubricating the faults with injection wells. Capturing emissions, using natural gas to power the equipment on the pad seems like a no-brainer, frankly. And we went through this whole period where we were building pad after pad after pad quickly. The pads are there. There's no reason you can't slow down and use fewer resources instead of going here and hopscotching everywhere to drill and to hold the leases. That period's over. Slow down, do it more systematically, fewer trucks. Recycling water is important, using brackish water, figuring out the chemistry to use brackish water instead of potable water, I think would be a smart start. There are probably others that other people have, but those just come to mind immediately.
Okay. And then, sorry, I have another question, if that's okay.
Fine.
What was it? Do you see this whole thing kind of overheating very soon and causing a big problem for us, or especially with our inability to export this natural gas? Like, where do you think we sit with that regard?
I think it kind of has overheated. I mean, natural gas prices have been, we're below $4. The only thing that kicked them up was this incredible winter we're having. So, I mean, I think we're in abundance of natural gas. There's been a lot of pain. I mean, a lot of companies are in pain. Including Chesapeake, yeah. Chesapeake, I mean, yeah, I could talk for hours about that. I don't see a bubble. I don't see red ink everywhere. I don't think this is like the savings and loan crisis. They're hard assets. The worst that happens is that if you're really cash flow negative, you can't get much more money. You sell your hard assets. You sell your fields. Someone will buy them. Might not be the price you want, but I don't see a bubble. So.
Thank you.
Yep. You want to? Phone around. But that said, I'm not an economist.
I guess my question is going back to the perception. There's been,
Yep.
we're not as positive about it. And I think it's, do you see that this as potentially a call for regulation because there's a perception that the industry has grown too fast? It obviously could be doing it much better than it is.
Right.
And it's not paying its way. It's socialized all the risks. So we're destroying roads that the industry could pay to repair. I mean, everyone's consuming the roads. The natural gas is being dumped on the market because we're going after the shale oil.
Yes.
And we're not even trying to recover a lot of that natural gas.
Right, we're flaring 25% of it from the Bakken.
What was that?
25% of natural gas in the Bakken is being flared.
Yeah. So obviously very wasteful. It creates a very obvious distaste.
You know, there's this concept of social license, that drillers have a social license to operate. And someone asked me about this the other day. I haven't seen a huge push to deny that social license, to basically say you can't drill, you're being wasteful, or the way you're operating, et cetera. The one place we're seeing it is in Colorado, where you had those votes to ban fracking, like 4 or 5 municipalities. And it was Boulder, but it was Fort Collins, and there was a bunch of them. So I think we're starting to see that a little in Colorado. And what's the response? The governor there has been much more proactive, talking about regulation, talking about how to do this. So this is sort of the yin and yang, right, of American politics. When people get upset and start talking, lo and behold, we start having more regulations being brought under control. So if you can tell me whether you're going to see more people upset about it and really kind of grassroots opposition to it, and not, we've clearly seen that in New York, then I think we'll have more regulation, and probably appropriate regulation too. That'd be my sense. So.
One right here. And do we have time for 2 more questions? And one more student question as well.
Okay, a couple questions. I'll be quick in my answers.
I think very nice talk, Russell. There's a great interest in actually applying a lot of this technology from the U.S. to China and Russia. We've had gobs of people coming down here and actually taking classes and visiting and so on. And the same with the Russians. They've just put up a big center here actually in the U.S. at UT. It turns out $21 million for doing. There's a new university there called Skolkovo, which we're helping to support there. In the Washtenaw Shale, don't hold your breath. It won't happen in the next 10 years. But
okay.
But it's for the reasons that you mentioned, which is private ownership of minerals and also the infrastructure in the place is just not there to support it. It's not that they wouldn't know how to do it. The Schlumbergers and the Halliburtons would be more than happy to go out there and do it for them. But I think for those 2 reasons, it's going to take a while for things to develop there. Okay. You made a very interesting comment about natural gas infrastructure helping the renewables.
Yes.
Could you elaborate on that a little bit?
Well, in my talks with grid operators, as we get more and more intermittent resources, wind and solar, onto the grid, there needs to be something to stabilize it. Coal is very poorly suited for that because coal plants cannot be ramped up and ramped down quickly. It's very, from what I understand, it's very inefficient and wears the plants out. Nuclear plants, once you turn them on, you want to keep them running. Natural gas is actually a very good fuel. You can run it at 20%, 40%, 60%, turn it on, turn it off much more quickly and easily. So if you're talking about bringing renewable resources to 25 or 40% without battery backup, you need something that you can switch on quickly. And that's where natural gas, I think, can play a big role. A lot of what I've seen, I think this is still developing, but a lot of what I've seen suggests that those 2 can actually work well together, although right now there's a lot of competition. A lot of people are making the point that low natural gas prices are hurting renewables. I think that's probably true. But once you get an alignment of the way power is dispatched, I think that could turn and change. And I think it should also. So.
Hi, I'm from Argentina. I don't know if
Argentina?
Yeah.
The Vaca Muerta.
Yeah, Vaca Muerta. We have like the second and 3rd position regarding to shale and oil technical recovery resources. So I'm not worried about the fast and hard because our
not fast in
country.
Argentina.
No, fast.
Yeah.
The big difference is that our oil fields are state-owned. So that one reason, and the other reason is that our political and economical instabilities, and not many people want to invest in Argentina.
Well, you had YPF, the part of Repsol, the Spanish company that was taken over by the national government. The other big problem there, we talked to a company like, I think it's Apache, that's big in Argentina, or Halliburton or Schlumberger, they have trouble repatriating their profits. So there's very little incentive for them to go down there because they might make $100 million. It can't leave Argentina.
Yeah, yeah.
And so that sort of does them no good. And so that's really been slowing down the development because you can't just call up and get the oilfield service companies, and the big oil producers don't want to go down there and partner with YPF because they're worried that...
The protectionism of the actual government is huge. But this maybe is going to change in the next 2 years. So my question is, what we should have done in a different way?
Well, I'm sorry, what was that?
What we should have done in a different way? What suggestions do you have for...
You mean when you start developing?
Yeah. We are working on that.
Yeah. I would do it in a more... I would do it in a slower pace. Once you start developing, I think the United States went so quickly that there was a lack of understanding of geology. In northern Pennsylvania, in the Marcellus, some of the water contamination that was discussed was because just a basic lack of understanding of the subsurface geology. Take time. It's a very complex system. Study the geology, figure out how to develop it quickly. Figure out how to develop it appropriately. Get the right regulations in place. You sort of set that up. You show a long-term structure. Government that's willing to work with it, and it will flow. From what I understand, the Vaca Muerta is a great shale. Very prolific. So don't do what the United States did, which was have these timers, 3 years to lease or to drill once you lease, because it was an all-out sprint. I mean, I talked to one CEO who was very involved in this from Range Resources, the former CEO of Range Resources, and he said he was picking up the phone and trying to talk to other CEOs that were working in the Marcellus, just to deal with some of these issues, because people were getting frightened and there were trucks going off the road. He couldn't get anyone on the phone. They couldn't coordinate. They couldn't do any of that because it was so, you needed to move quickly or else you were going to lose your money.
But what about the government's position and responsibility on that? I mean...
In the United States, the issue typically has been the government's tried to balance promoting this for the economic benefit with being appropriate regulators. And too often you see that the same people, the same government agency is charged with being the regulator and the promoter. That's what we had in the Gulf of Mexico until a few years ago. That's an untenable position. That's what we have in North Dakota right now. You cannot simultaneously be the cheerleader and the cop. Create two organizations. One's the cop, one's the cheerleader. That works a lot better.
We're out of time. Thank you so much.